As we drink this month's beautiful Mao Cha from Dashui-san, which we call Forest Song, we thought it would be a great opportunity to cover all the ins and outs of pu'er processing, so you would understand the 5 basic kinds of pu'er tea and how they're processed. And then there's some subtle variations in each kind that add some complication. But overall, pu'er tea actually isn't that complicated of a genre of tea, and understanding how it's processed is relatively easy. We have the 5 kinds of pu'er tea here. Before we go into these 5 though, there's something they all have in common, which is that they all start out as Mao Cha. Mao Cha means rough tea, so it means unfinished tea. And this is the tea from the farm. Now, there are 4 eras in pu'er: the antique era, the masterpiece era, the Chizabing era, and the newborn era. In the antique era, which is anything pre-1949, tea was completely finished on the mountain of origin. But since then, Mao Cha has been collected from mountains and finished in factories since 1949. So there is a few places that have kind of gone retro and that are finishing the tea on the mountain, which is ideal because, as we'll talk about later, pu'er tea is compressed, and that means that then the compression will happen on the mountain with steam generated from the water that is the same water the trees drank from, and that's obviously beneficial if the entire process is finished on the mountain. But that's really rare nowadays. Mostly it comes to the factory as Mao Cha. So before you can get into the distinctions between the 5 kinds of pu'er, you have to understand Mao Cha itself and how the tea arrives at the factory as Mao Cha. Now, Forest Song itself actually is a Mao Cha. So this month's tea actually is a Mao Cha. So Mao Cha is, again, the tea right from the farm sent to the factory, the unfinished tea. That's what Mao Cha means: rough tea, unfinished tea. So it's basically pu'er tea after it's gone through its processing before it's finalized, finished, you could say, in the factory. Processing on the farm is really rather simple. It's harvested, then it's withered. Withering in all tea is to remove moisture, because tea leaf, when you pick it from a tree or any other leaf, is very brittle, so you couldn't process it until some of the moisture goes out. It also causes oxidation. So oxidation happens, the moisture content decreases. The withering of pu'er tea usually takes place outdoors. It can be indoors a little bit if they're constricted by weather and they need to finish tea on time. And then the tea is fired, which is called saqin, de-enzymed. This is literally, in Chinese, it translates to kill green. Kills a green enzyme in the tea that makes tea very bitter. And then it's rolled, which is the shaping, right? The kill green actually also arrests the oxidation that was happening in the withering process. So after the firing in a wok, it's rolled, which shapes the tea and further breaks the cells down. And then it's sun-dried, traditionally, hopefully. It's sun-dried. Some pu'er is not sun-dried anymore. When pu'er tea is oven-dried, it often becomes very smoky. That's not the only reason that pu'er tea can have a smoky flavor. Pu'er tea often has a smoky flavor just because it's stored in Aboriginal houses where they do all their cooking on wood fire. Or it can have a smoky flavor because the saqin was done on a wet day, and so the wood was wet. So the tea is picked, withered, fired, de-enzymed, rolled, and then sun-dried. And all of these stages really are there in every tea. So what really makes pu'er tea different from other kinds of tea is there's 2 places. Number 1 is in the de-enzyming, in the firing, in the saqin. The saqin of pu'er tea is done for a shorter duration at a lower temperature. This is important. And the second part of pu'er that is unique is the sun-drying. And the reason that the de-enzyming is done at a lower temperature for a shorter amount of time and the tea is sun-dried has to do with the fact that pu'er tea is fermented, right? And in tea, we have to know the difference between oxidation and fermentation. Oxidation is, again, when the leaves, remember, they're losing their moisture, they're becoming limp and soft right after they're picked. That's a lot like a banana turning brown on a table. It's the cells, breaking down due to exposure to oxygen. And fermentation includes bacteria and yeasts. That's like yogurt or cheese. And in pu'er's case, that happens post-production. It actually is one of the characteristics of pu'er that makes it so special, is before the leaves are even picked from the trees. The trees themselves are covered in the hundreds and hundreds of species of mold and bacteria and fungus and all this microbial activity that is one of the defining characteristics of what makes pu'er tea so special. So other teas can ferment, but you could say none as magically as pu'er because it comes from those rainforests, especially when it's old growth pu'er, not plantation pu'er, but real traditional pu'er from the rainforests. The reason that the sachin then is done at a lower temperature for a shorter duration is so that the spores, the heat-resistant spores in the tea will survive that, right? And then obviously the sun drying reactivates them at the end so that their colonies come back, and then the fermentation can begin. So malcha is harvested, withered to oxidize it and remove moisture. Then it's fired to arrest the oxidation, remember at a lower temperature for a short duration of time so that the heat-resistant spores survive. And then it's rolled and shaped and then sun-dried, which reactivates the spores and the fermentation starts again. Then malcha like that comes from many, many different tea-growing mountains to the factory to be finished. And that's where we get into the different kinds of pu'er tea. An important division is whether the tea is going to be single region or blended. Now, between 1949 and 1998, that's two eras. 1949 to 1972 is Masterpiece era, and then 72 to 98 is called the Chizabing era. In that time, 1949 to 1998, roughly, almost all tea was blended. All the big factories, they all blended their tea. They mixed teas from different regions, and that can be good. Traditionally, in the antique era, all tea was single region, so it was single mountain. As I said, it was processed completely on the mountain of origin, so it was single region. When you seed propagate tea, then every tree is really going to be unique, so on the ultimate absolute level, every tea is really going to be a blend. But here, when we're talking about blending, we're not talking about that absolute level. We're talking about, different mountains blended together versus a single mountain. In the 1990s, Taiwanese pu'er lovers renewed the practice of single region. Right? They had drunk all of this antique era, pre-1949 tea that was all single region, and they wanted that to come back. So they revitalized the single region kind of tradition. And you'll find some debate amongst pu'er lovers whether blended tea is better or single region is better. And it's hard really to say. All things equal, if trees are old and the mountain's really good, single region tea, especially if it's completely processed at origin, will probably be better. But there can be some really great blends too, because what this region is lacking, this one maybe makes up for, right? So this one has more chi and strength and it's better for aging, and this one's a little bit more delicious, and you can blend the two together. So once the tea comes to the factory, it can either stay single region or it can be blended. And that will be true for each of the kinds of tea that we're going to discuss. They can stay single region or they can be blended. Okay, so now we come to the greatest distinction in pu'er that most of you have heard, which is between sheng and shou, raw and ripe pu'er, raw pu'er and ripe pu'er. So raw pu'er and ripe pu'er are basically distinguished by how they ferment post-production. So raw sheng pu'er is naturally fermented over time, and ripe shou pu'er is artificially fermented. So this is the main distinction. So now that the malcha has arrived in the factory, if it's going to stay as sheng, little else happens to it. So it either stays single region or is blended and packaged as loose leaf pu'er, sheng pu'er, or it's left single region or blended and then steamed and compressed and packaged as a cake of sheng pu'er. So those are the two things that could happen to it right then. You can, if you take out the single region and blended to make things simpler, you could just say it's left as loose leaf or it's steamed and compressed into a cake, and that's it. You might then ask, what's the difference really between malcha and loose leaf sheng pu'er? Really, there isn't any. I mean, if it's blended, then there is, because then they've taken teas from a few different regions and put them together into one loose leaf tea and packaged it. But really, the only thing that if it's malcha that arrives at the factory, like for a song, this here, and then they just package it and call it loose leaf pu'er, I mean, the only difference between loose leaf pu'er and Mao cha is that it's been packaged, weighed and packaged. That's it. So it arrived in bulk as Mao cha, and then it was separated. So bad leaves were picked out, and it was packaged. But in between 1949 and 98, almost all of that kind of loose leaf pu'er would have been blended. So it would have been blended at the factory and then packaged, and that would have been like a sheng, a loose leaf sheng. More often, pu'er tea is compressed. So either as single region or blended, it would then be steamed and compressed, traditionally using stones that they dance on, but nowadays often with machines, which isn't as good. And that's sheng. And that type of tea then needs to ferment over time, which we've talked about in previous issues. We've talked about it in previous videos. It takes 70 years to reach full maturity. So I'm going to send around. We have here, this is Pu'er Song, the tea of the month. So this is a Mao cha. This never went to the factory. But you could say this is the same as single region loose leaf pu'er. The only real distinction between this and that is that this arrived here in bulk, and that would have been sorted. In other words, you know, huang pian, leaves that are not wanted, would have been picked out and it would have been packaged. That's it. There's no real difference. And then here we have a cake. So this is a Mao cha that came. This is also single region. So this is a single region cake. So the Mao cha came to the factory. It was steamed and compressed into a cake and then packaged, right? Either of these could be single region or blended. So basically, sheng, all that happens to sheng is the Mao cha comes to the factory and it's either blended or not and packaged, or it's compressed, blended or not and packaged. And if you take out the single region versus blended complication, really all that happens is the Mao cha comes to the factory and it's packaged or it's compressed and packaged. That's it, right? The complication being that it's sometimes blended first before it's packaged or compressed and packaged, right? And then this tea will age over time. It will ferment naturally. That's sheng, that's raw tea. So when it's young, it's astringent and green and bitter. And then over time, it becomes deep and dark and mellow and transforms in this amazing, beautiful way as the bacteria and the yeast do their magic. And the fermentation and aging of pu'er is another video, not this basic one. So this last tea here, this is an aged loose leaf sheng. So this one's about 30 years old. So we can send these two around together, and you can have a look, and you'll see that this is Pu'er Song, our tea of the month. This is a new loose leaf sheng pu'er, and this is a 30-year-old sheng pu'er. So you can see what the natural fermentation does to the tea. We'll drink these two, and then you'll be able to taste them. So in the case of sheng pu'er, the tea is going to age much better in a compressed form. So cakes will age much better than loose leaf tea. Again, fermentation and aging is really beyond the context of this video. It's for another video. There are a lot of aspects of fermentation that we don't understand. One of the reasons for this that we do understand, obviously, is that the compression, the steam in the compression, creates a more conducive environment for the microbial life to do its work. But there's many aspects, obviously, that we don't understand as well. Suffice it to say, the same tea, all things equal, the loose leaf tea will not age as well as the compressed tea. So not only does pu'er age better in a cake than in loose leaf, but loose leaf pu'er has this other complication, which is that then tea can actually be blended into it later. So when you get aged loose leaf sheng, right, one of the reasons that aged loose leaf sheng is cheaper is that it doesn't have a vintage. There's no verifiable vintage. With a cake, we have the wrapper, and we can study the kind of wrapperology, you can't, once it's compressed, you can't uncompress it and recompress it. That would be obvious. But a loose leaf tea can have stuff added to it. So most of the aged loose leaf sheng pu'ers that you have might even have some show in them, or they have some younger tea that was added 10 years later. So they were aged for 10 years and then somebody added some young tea. So this other blending can happen post-production in the case of loose leaf sheng pu'er. So it's very rare to have a loose leaf aged sheng or show that just sat without any businessman adding anything to it over time. So Mao cha comes, it's blended or single region and packaged as loose leaf tea, or it's blended or single region and compressed, steamed and compressed and packaged as sheng pu'er in a cake. Both of those then can be aged naturally over time. Then in the 60s, Puerh producers wanted to create artificial fermentation. They wanted to try to recreate what nature does in 70 years in a shorter period of time. Obviously, they weren't successful in that. You can't steal from nature in that way. The aged puerh that is created over 70 years is magical. Sheng puerh will always be the better of the two. What they were successful in was creating a new kind, a new genre of puerh tea, which we call shou or ripe, which basically means that it has post-production artificial fermentation. So Sheng is post-production natural fermentation or aging, and shou, ripe puerh, is post-production artificial fermentation. And so in the 60s, the factories made the decision that they wanted to have that kind of processing for shou. They had originally the idea that they could speed up what takes nature 70 years, they could do it artificially quicker. So the piling of shou puerh came from Liuba, actually. Guangxi and Guangzhou in general, Guangxi and Guangzhou and Yunnan had a long relationship between tea producers, sending tea back and forth. Sometimes Guangzhou tea would make it into puerh cakes. So a lot of puerh cakes would make it into Guangzhou tea. There's liubaos that are made of Yunnan tea. When those farmers ran out of tea, they would take tea from Yunnan, and vice versa. There's Guanyuengong cakes that have Guangxi tea in them. So the relationship between those two regions was already really strong. So of course they had to adapt the processing, which you can't copy because the microbial life there is different from everywhere else. So the bacteria and the microbial life is different. It will create a very different terroir. So you could, in essence, include microbial life in terroir. So of course, shou puerh is going to be very different than other kinds of black tea like Liubao or Hunan black tea because of the difference in the microbial life in Yunnan, and also the different raw material, different kinds of trees, different kinds of tea. This is a large leaf, right? You could say the tea in Liubao is actually kind of like medium leaf, right? And other places, sometimes even small leaf. So different kind of tree, different kind of raw material, different microbial life means different fermentation. And then of course the humans would adapt that fermentation process to suit the microbial ecology there and the kind of raw material that they're working with. So over the 60s, the entire 60s mostly, they were doing lots of research and adapting the methods of other black tea from Liubao mostly towards puerh production. And then the date that you'll see in most magazines and books is 1972 or 3. Actually, 73 is the accurate date. Sometimes you even see 74. 73 is the accurate date, but that's not really when shou began. We have here a 1965 brick of shou, for example, that was in the experimental period. 1973 is when the government gave license to the factories to actually begin to commercially produce and sell shou puerh. So that's when it began officially. This artificial fermentation happens in a way that's very similar to composting. Essentially, the tea is piled, the mao cha is piled. Now again, it can be single region or blended. It's very rare to have an intentionally produced shou puerh, which is why they're hard to find organic versions of. It's very hard to find organic shou because most of the time, because shou is an inferior tea, it's made from whatever the factory has left at the end of the year, and it's all mixed together. And sometimes factories do intentionally blend. Traditionally, they did that when puerh wasn't as valuable. But something's lost in the piling, and so Sheng tea is the highest quality teas from the factories are always going to be the Sheng teas, and shous are always going to be inferior. So the shou rarely will be a single region, but it technically could be a single region mao cha or a blend, and it's then piled and sprayed with water and covered with a thermal blanket. If they're doing it well, if they know what they're doing, they will also introduce bacteria and spores and fungus from previous batches to recolonize this one. And then essentially it's just stirred. It takes between 45 and 60 days to completely artificially ferment puerh tea. Traditionally, shou was produced much more skillfully. They would pile it and they would stop the fermentation at a much lower degree. Sometimes the artificial fermentation was as low as 40 or 50%, and that meant the tea could then age over time. But to stop the fermentation at the right degree that's suitable for those leaves is very difficult. So nowadays, they usually just completely artificially ferment it for 45 to 60 days, which results in a darker, more pondy kind of flavor, ammonia flavor. And then what happens is the tea doesn't have much room to age. What happens to it is it just kind of mellows out, and those what we call dui wei, because that piling is called wo dui. So the flavor of the piling flavor, the dui wei, will decrease over time as as the tea is aged, but it won't really shift and change the way that a sheng would. So the tea is piled, sprayed with water. Ideally, you have bacteria and fungus and molds and etc., all the microbial life from previous batches introduced, covered with a thermal blanket, and then just periodically stirred until it's gone through its artificial fermentation. At that point, it can then, just like sheng, be packaged loose leaf or steamed and compressed and packaged as a cake. So the shou tea is the same. And the shou tea can be blended twice, if you think about it, because they could have two batches going. So it could be blended in the sense that different regions are blended together and then piled, but you could also have different pilings blended together and packaged as loose leaf or a cake, right? But it has to be, ideally, it has to be compressed immediately after the piling. Because the artificial fermentation breaks down the cells in the leaves so much that when they dry, they're so crinkled that if you wanted to compress them later, so if you made some shou tea, you piled it for, like, let's say 45 days, and then you dried it, and so you have some loose leaf shou, and then you aged it for 3 or 4 years, and you wanted to then make a cake out of it, you would have to steam it like 3 times what you ordinarily would steam a tea, and that would actually damage the quality severely. People do it, but it would damage the quality. So ideally, shou has to be compressed while it's still wet before it dries if you want to make it into a cake. So shou has this added step, right? Sheng basically comes to the factory as maocha and is compressed and packaged or just packaged. Shou tea goes through this added step of piling, this artificial fermentation, and then is packaged loose leaf or it is compressed and packaged. So here we have a cake of shou. So this one has been piled and then compressed and packaged, and here we have a loose leaf shou, so you can see the difference. So at first, pu'er processing might seem complicated, but if you chart it out in your mind, it actually is kind of simple. It starts out as maocha, which is the part of pu'er that happens on the farm. The tea is picked, withered, and that's to oxidize it and reduce moisture content. And then it is fired to de-enzyme it and arrest the oxidation. Remember, the firing happens at a lower temperature for a shorter duration so that the heat-resistant spores will survive. The tea is then rolled and shaped and sun-dried, which also has the added benefit of reactivating the colony of the microbial life in the pu'er, because pu'er tea is fermented, post-production fermented. So those are the two defining features really that separate it from other kinds of tea, is that the sachin is done at lower temperature for a shorter duration and that it's sun-dried. And then that maocha comes to the factory, and it can either then be sheng or shou. Sheng tea is the better, more traditional way. That means natural fermentation. The higher quality teas are going to be naturally fermented over time. It takes 70 years to reach full maturity. Or the tea becomes shou, which is ripe, which means it has post-production artificial fermentation. So sheng is post-production natural fermentation, shou is post-production artificial fermentation. The artificial fermentation happens in the form of piling, which is much like composting. The tea is piled and sprayed with water. Ideally, there would be microbial life from previous batches introduced, and then it's sprayed with water, covered with a thermal blanket to keep it warm in there, which is why it's sometimes called cooked pu'er also, because it's hot in there, right? And then it is artificially fermented. Traditionally, back in the day, they would stop the artificial fermentation at a much lower rate, like 40, 50%, 60%, whatever suited the leaves, and then the shou pu'er could actually age. Nowadays, usually they just completely artificially ferment it, which takes about 45 to 60 days, right? So then we have these sheng and shou teas. They can be sold loose leaf or they can be steamed and compressed into cakes. So you essentially have all these different kinds of pu'er tea. You have loose leaf sheng pu'er, young and old. You have a cake of sheng pu'er, young and old. You have shou pu'er, loose leaf, could be young and old also, and you have a cake of shou, which also could be young and old. So if you add the dimension of age, you separate each of the four into two. You could also add another dimension, which we talked about, which is single region versus blended. So you have single region loose leaf sheng, or a single region cake, or a blended loose leaf, or a blended cake. Same with the shou. You could have a single region loose leaf show or cake show or a blended loose leaf or cake show. So you can distinguish by new and old, by aged and newborn. You could also distinguish by blended and single region. So we're continuing our tour. Tasting is believing. You got to taste all the differences between the different kinds of pu'er, see how different they are. And in the beginning, it may seem complicated, but when you begin to understand everything, it actually is a simpler kind of tea. Oolong tea is even more complicated. There's even a richer skill and production history and lore that goes into oolong tea. Pu'er tea is actually relatively simple.